Your soulmate could not sleep last night. Here is why. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because while the world slowly became quiet and most people drifted peacefully into sleep, your soulmate found themselves lying awake, staring into the darkness, unable to silence the thoughts moving through their mind. And listen to this. At first, they believed it was just one of those ordinary restless nights everyone experiences from time to time. They shifted positions. They checked the clock. They closed their eyes and tried to relax. They told themselves they simply needed a few more minutes and sleep would eventually arrive. But the minutes passed. Then an hour passed. Then another. And somehow, the more they tried to force themselves to rest, the more awake they seemed to become. And your heart needs this right now because what was keeping them awake wasn't something happening around them. It wasn't noise. It wasn't stress. It wasn't a problem that needed solving before morning. It was something much deeper. Something internal. Something emotional. Something they had been carrying quietly for longer than they realized. And listen to this, the night has a strange way of bringing hidden feelings to the surface. During the day, people stay busy. They focus on work, responsibilities, conversations, distractions, and routines. There is always something demanding attention. But at night, when the world becomes silent, all those distractions disappear. And when they disappear, people are often left alone with the one thing they have been avoiding most, their own thoughts. At first, they tried not to think. They scrolled through their phone. They watched the clock. They distracted themselves with random things. They told themselves tomorrow would be different. But the thoughts refused to leave. And listen to this, every time they tried to focus on something else, their mind kept returning to the same place. The same memories. The same feelings. The same unanswered questions. It was as though something inside them was trying to get their attention and refusing to be ignored any longer. And your heart needs this right now because sometimes the things that keep us awake are not problems. Sometimes they are truths waiting to be acknowledged. The room was quiet. The world outside was quiet. But inside them, there was movement. Inside them, there were questions. Inside them, there was reflection. And listen to this, as the hours continued passing, they began noticing something unusual. The thoughts returning to them weren't random. They weren't disconnected. They all seemed connected by a single thread. Every memory led to another memory. Every feeling led to another feeling. Every question seemed connected to something deeper. And your heart needs this right now because when thoughts keep returning in that way, there is usually a reason. There is usually something important beneath the surface trying to make itself known. The more they reflected, the more certain memories stood out. The more certain memories stood out, the more emotional they became. The more emotional they became, the harder it became to sleep. And listen to this. They found themselves replaying moments they hadn't thought about in a long time. Moments that once seemed ordinary. Conversations that once seemed simple. Tiny details that never felt important before. Yet somehow, in the silence of that night, those details felt different. They felt meaningful. They felt alive. And your heart needs this right now, because sometimes we don't understand the significance of certain moments until much later. Sometimes it takes distance. Sometimes it takes reflection. Sometimes it takes a sleepless night. The clock kept moving. The darkness remained. Sleep stayed far away. And listen to this, eventually they stopped trying to force themselves to rest. They stopped pretending nothing was happening. They stopped fighting the thoughts. Instead, they began listening to them. Really listening. And that changed everything. Because your heart needs this right now. There is a huge difference between hearing your thoughts and understanding them. For the first time, they allowed themselves to sit with what they were feeling instead of pushing it away. And as they did, a realization began forming. Not a dramatic realization. Not a sudden revelation. A quiet realization. A gradual realization. The kind that grows stronger with every passing minute. And listen to this, they began recognizing that what was keeping them awake wasn't confusion. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't uncertainty. It was awareness. Awareness of feelings they hadn't fully explored. Awareness of emotions they hadn't fully understood. Awareness of truths they hadn't fully accepted. And your heart needs this right now, because awareness can be powerful. Once it appears, it changes everything. Once it appears, it becomes difficult to return to the way things were before. They started asking themselves questions. Questions they usually avoided. Questions they rarely allowed themselves to consider. Questions that carried emotional weight. And listen to this, each question seemed to lead them towards something deeper. Something more meaningful. Something that felt impossible to ignore. Every answer uncovered another layer. Every reflection revealed another piece of understanding. And slowly, the restless energy that had kept them awake began transforming into something else. Clarity. Not complete clarity. Not perfect clarity. But enough clarity to realize that the night was changing them. And your heart needs this right now, because sometimes the most important moments in life happen when nobody else is around. Not during celebrations. Not during major events. But during quiet nights when a person is alone with their thoughts and finally allows themselves to be honest. Honest about what they feel. Honest about what matters. Honest about what they can no longer ignore. And listen to this. By the time the deepest part of the night arrived, they were no longer frustrated about being awake. They were no longer checking the clock every few minutes. They were no longer trying to escape their thoughts. Instead, they were beginning to understand them. And that understanding brought something unexpected. Peace. A small amount at first. Then more. Then enough to realize that the sleepless night wasn't happening to them. It was happening for them. And your heart needs this right now, because not every restless night is a burden. Sometimes a restless night is an invitation. An invitation to slow down. An invitation to reflect. An invitation to hear the truths that daily life keeps buried beneath noise and distraction. As the night continued and morning slowly approached, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another night. This wasn't just another collection of thoughts. This wasn't just another moment of restlessness. Something important was unfolding inside them. Something meaningful was waking up. And whether they were fully ready for it or not, the journey toward understanding had already begun. Your soulmate could not sleep last night. Here is why. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because after hours of lying awake, after countless attempts to convince themselves that sleep would eventually come, your soulmate realized something important. The reason they could not sleep was not because their mind was racing randomly. It was because certain thoughts refused to leave. Certain memories refused to fade. Certain emotions refused to remain hidden. And listen to this. The longer they stayed awake, the more those memories seemed to come alive. At first, they tried to ignore them. They told themselves it was just nostalgia. They told themselves it was just late-night overthinking. They told themselves they were simply tired. But the memories kept returning. Again. And again. And again. And your heart needs this right now because some memories only return when they have something left to teach us. Some moments stay with us because they contain meaning we did not fully understand when they first happened. And as your soulmate stared into the darkness, they found themselves revisiting moments they had not thought about in a very long time. Small moments. Quiet moments. Simple moments. Moments most people would forget. And listen to this. It wasn't the dramatic events that returned to their mind. It wasn't the biggest conversations or the most obvious experiences. Instead, it was the little things. A sentence that stayed with them. A feeling they experienced during a brief interaction. A memory of someone's energy. A moment that lasted only seconds but somehow left a lasting impression. And your heart needs this right now because the heart often remembers what the mind overlooks. The more they reflected, the more details returned. The more details returned, the more emotional the memories became. The more emotional the memories became, the more impossible sleep felt. And listen to this, they started asking themselves why those memories still mattered. Why they carried weight after all this time. Why they felt different now than they did before. Because your heart needs this right now, people rarely question memories that mean nothing. The memories we revisit repeatedly often contain lessons, feelings, or truths that remain unfinished in some way. The clock continued moving. The night continued deepening. Yet their attention remained fixed on the past. Not because they wanted to live there, but because something in those memories still felt important. And listen to this, as they replayed those moments, they began seeing them differently. Things that once appeared ordinary now seemed significant. Things they once dismissed now appeared meaningful. The distance of time gave them a new perspective. And your heart needs this right now because perspective changes everything. Sometimes we need time before we understand what a moment truly meant. Suddenly, patterns started appearing. Connections started forming. Emotions started making sense. And listen to this, they realized that many of the memories returning to them shared something in common. They all carried the same feeling. A feeling they had not fully acknowledged before. A feeling they had buried beneath responsibilities, routines, and everyday distractions. And your heart needs this right now because feelings do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They wait. Quietly. Patiently. Until the right moment arrives. And last night, that moment arrived. The silence gave those feelings room to breathe. The darkness gave those feelings room to speak. The sleeplessness gave those feelings room to be heard. And listen to this, for the first time in a long time, they stopped running from those emotions. They stopped pushing them away. They stopped telling themselves there was nothing there. Instead, they allowed themselves to sit with what they felt. And that simple act changed everything. Because your heart needs this right now, understanding begins the moment resistance ends. The moment they stopped fighting their thoughts. The thoughts became clearer. The moment they stopped rejecting their feelings. The feelings became easier to understand. The moment they stopped distracting themselves. The truth moved closer. And listen to this, as that truth approached, something unexpected happened. The memories no longer felt random. They no longer felt disconnected. Instead, they felt like pieces of a story. Pieces of a larger understanding that had been quietly forming for a long time. One memory led to another. One realization led to another. One emotion led to another. Until eventually, everything seemed connected. And your heart needs this right now because clarity rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in fragments. Small realizations. Tiny insights. Brief moments of understanding. And during that sleepless night, those fragments were beginning to come together. The confusion started fading. The noise started fading. The distractions started fading. And what remained was something much deeper. Awareness. And listen to this, awareness can be both comforting and uncomfortable at the same time. Comforting because it brings understanding. Uncomfortable because it asks us to acknowledge truths we may have avoided. And your heart needs this right now because your soulmate was experiencing both at once. Part of them felt relieved. Part of them felt emotional. Part of them felt uncertain. But beneath all of those feelings was a growing sense that something important was happening. Something real. Something meaningful. And listen to this, by now, they were no longer frustrated about being awake. The sleeplessness had become a journey. A journey through memories. Through emotions. Through reflections they had not allowed themselves to explore before. And every step of that journey seemed to bring them closer to understanding. Not complete understanding. Not final answers. But enough understanding to know that the night was changing them. Enough understanding to know that these thoughts mattered. Enough understanding to know that these feelings were not going away. And your heart needs this right now because sometimes a sleepless night is not a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes it is a sign that something important is trying to be understood. Sometimes it is a sign that the heart is finally ready to speak. And as the night continued unfolding around them, one thing became impossible to ignore. The memories returning to them were not there by accident. They were there for a reason. A reason that would become clearer with every passing hour. A reason that would eventually change the way they understood everything. And the deeper they traveled into those memories, the closer they moved toward a truth they could no longer avoid. Your soulmate could not sleep last night. Here is why. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because somewhere in the middle of that long, sleepless night, something inside your soulmate began to change. The memories had already returned. The emotions had already surfaced. The questions had already filled their mind. But listen to this, what happened next was different. The night stopped being about remembering, and it started becoming about understanding. For hours, they had been replaying moments. For hours, they had been revisiting old feelings. For hours, they had been trying to figure out why sleep refused to come. And your heart needs this right now because eventually they realized that the answer was not hidden in the future. It was hidden within themselves. And listen to this, there comes a moment when a person becomes tired of running from their own feelings. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Tired of questioning. Tired of doubting. Tired of pretending certain emotions are not there. And during that quiet night, your soulmate reached that moment. They stopped trying to distract themselves. They stopped trying to force different thoughts into their mind. They stopped trying to convince themselves that everything was normal. Instead, they listened. Really listened. For perhaps the first time in a very long time. And your heart needs this right now because when someone truly listens to their heart, things begin changing. The noise starts fading. The confusion starts fading. The excuses start fading. And beneath all of that noise, something clearer begins to appear. A truth. A realization. An understanding. And listen to this, at first, that realization was difficult to see. It was buried beneath years of caution, years of overthinking, years of emotional self-protection. But the longer they sat in silence, the more visible it became. Every memory they revisited seemed connected. Every feeling pointed in the same direction. Every question seemed to lead toward the same answer. The answer had been there all along. Waiting. Patiently. Quietly. And your heart needs this right now because sometimes the hardest truth to accept is not the one we don't know. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one we already know deep down but have not been ready to face. And listen to this, they began realizing that many of the feelings they had dismissed were actually important. Many of the thoughts they had pushed aside were actually meaningful. Many of the emotions they had ignored were actually trying to guide them towards something they needed to understand. That realization felt powerful. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just undeniable. And your heart needs this right now because undeniable truths have a unique feeling. They do not need to argue for attention. They do not need to prove themselves. They simply exist. Quietly. Steadily. Persistently. The more they reflected, the stronger the realization became. the stronger the realization became. The harder it became to ignore. The harder it became to ignore. The more clarity appeared. And listen to this, clarity can be emotional. Not because it creates confusion, but because it removes confusion. When someone spends a long time questioning themselves and suddenly begins understanding what they truly feel, it can be incredibly powerful. And your heart needs this right now because that is exactly what was happening. They were not discovering something new. They were recognizing something that had been there all along. The signs. The feelings. The understanding. It had all been present. They simply hadn't allowed themselves to see it clearly before. And listen to this, there may have been moments during that night when they looked at the clock and realized how many hours had passed. Hours spent thinking. Hours spent reflecting. Hours spent understanding themselves in a way they hadn't for a very long time. Yet strangely, they no longer felt frustrated. Because your heart needs this right now, the sleeplessness had a purpose now. The sleeplessness was teaching them something. The sleeplessness was revealing something. The sleeplessness was creating space for honesty. And honesty changes everything. And listen to this, the more honest they became with themselves, the more peaceful they felt. Not because they suddenly had all the answers. Not because every question disappeared. But because they stopped fighting what they felt. They stopped resisting. They stopped denying. They stopped running. And in that moment, something inside them relaxed. Not their body. Their heart. And your heart needs this right now because some of the greatest breakthroughs happen when a person finally stops trying to control every emotion and simply allows themselves to feel it. The realization was no longer hiding. The truth was no longer hiding. The understanding was no longer hiding. Everything was slowly coming into focus. And listen to this, as the night continued, they began seeing their situation differently than they had before. The things that once seemed confusing suddenly appeared simple. The things that once seemed uncertain suddenly felt clearer. The things that once seemed distant suddenly felt closer. That is what clarity does. It simplifies. It reveals. It illuminates. And your heart needs this right now because by this point, your soulmate was no longer the same person who had gone to bed earlier that night. Something had shifted. Something had awakened. Something had changed. Not in the outside world. Inside them. And listen to this, growth often happens exactly this way. Quietly. Privately. Without anyone else noticing. No announcements. No dramatic scenes. Just a person sitting alone in the darkness, finally understanding something their soul has been trying to tell them for a very long time. That understanding became stronger. Minute by minute. Hour by hour. Thought by thought. Until eventually it became impossible to deny. And your heart needs this right now because by the time the deepest part of the night arrived, one thing had become clear. They could no longer pretend they didn't know what they knew. They could no longer pretend they didn't feel what they felt. They could no longer return to the version of themselves that existed before this realization. Because some nights change people. Some nights reveal truths. Some nights become turning points. And last night was one of those nights. The night they stopped running. The night they started listening. The night they finally allowed themselves to see the truth that had been waiting for them all along. And once that truth was seen, everything else began changing with it. Your soulmate could not sleep last night. Here is why. Don't skip. Listen to this carefully. This message is for you, and your heart needs this right now, because as the night slowly began surrendering to the morning, your soulmate found themselves sitting with a feeling they could no longer ignore. The darkness outside was fading. The hours had slipped by unnoticed. The silence that once felt heavy now felt meaningful. And listen to this, something had changed during those sleepless hours. Not in the world around them. Not in their circumstances. But inside them. For most of the night, they had been searching. Searching for answers. Searching for understanding. Searching for a reason why sleep refused to come. But your heart needs this right now because by the time the first signs of morning appeared, they realized the night had never been about sleep at all. It had been about clarity. It had been about honesty. It had been about finally listening to what their heart had been trying to say. And listen to this. There comes a moment when reflection stops feeling like confusion and starts feeling like understanding. A moment when the endless questions finally begin leading somewhere. A moment when all the scattered thoughts suddenly connect. And your heart needs this right now because that moment had arrived. The memories made sense. The emotions made sense. The sleeplessness made sense. Everything seemed different now. Not because anything had changed externally. Because they had changed internally. And listen to this, throughout the night, they had revisited moments they once overlooked. They had replayed conversations. Reflected on feelings. Examined thoughts they had been pushing aside for a long time. And your heart needs this right now because every reflection brought them closer to a truth they had been avoiding. A truth about themselves. A truth about what matters to them. A truth about what they can no longer pretend not to feel. The closer they moved toward that truth, the lighter they began feeling. The lighter they felt. The clearer everything became. And listen to this, clarity is a powerful thing. It doesn't always arrive dramatically. It doesn't always appear with certainty and confidence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like sunlight entering a dark room. Slowly. Gently. Naturally. And your heart needs this right now because that is exactly how clarity entered their life that morning. Little by little. Thought by thought. Realization by realization. Until the confusion that once filled their mind began disappearing. And listen to this. They may have looked out the window as the sky started changing colors. They may have noticed how different everything felt compared to a few hours earlier. The same room. The same surroundings. The same world. Yet somehow everything seemed new. Because your heart needs this right now, perspective changes reality. When someone understands themselves better, the entire world feels different. When someone stops fighting their feelings, peace begins appearing. When someone accepts the truth, fear loses its power. And that is exactly what was happening. The fear was fading. The resistance was fading. The uncertainty was fading. And in its place came something unexpected. Acceptance. And listen to this, acceptance is not giving up. Acceptance is not surrendering. Acceptance is understanding. It is looking at something honestly and saying, this is real. This matters. This deserves my attention. And your heart needs this right now because for the first time in a long time, they were allowing themselves to do exactly that. No more running. No more avoiding. No more pretending. Just honesty. Pure honesty. And honesty has a way of creating freedom. And listen to this, they realized that the reason the night felt so emotional was because they had spent so much time carrying thoughts they never fully explored. Feelings they never fully acknowledged. Questions they never fully answered. And your heart needs this right now because emotional weight does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It remains. Quietly. Patiently. Waiting for the moment someone is ready to face it. Last night became that moment. The moment they stopped carrying those feelings unconsciously. The moment they started understanding them consciously. The moment everything began changing. And listen to this. As morning continued arriving, a deep sense of calm started settling inside them. Not because every problem was solved. Not because every answer was found. But because they finally knew which direction their heart was pointing. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes clarity is not having every answer. Sometimes clarity is simply knowing what is true. And your heart needs this right now because truth has a calming effect. Truth removes the exhausting need to constantly question everything. Truth removes the pressure to keep pretending. Truth creates space for peace. And your soulmate was finally beginning to feel that peace. The peace that follows honesty. The peace that follows understanding. The peace that follows acceptance. And listen to this, if someone had looked at them that morning, they may not have noticed anything different. There were no dramatic announcements. No dramatic actions. No dramatic scenes. But inside, something significant had happened. A chapter had closed. A realization had arrived. A truth had been accepted. And your heart needs this right now because some of the biggest transformations happened silently. Not in front of crowds. Not in front of cameras. But alone. During quiet mornings. After long nights. When a person finally understands something they have been searching for all along. And listen to this, by the time the sun fully rose, your soulmate understood something important. The sleepless night was not a punishment. It was a gift. A gift disguised as restlessness. A gift disguised as reflection. A gift disguised as uncertainty. Because it led them toward something valuable. It led them toward truth. And once truth enters someone's heart, it becomes impossible to completely ignore again. So if something feels different lately, if the energy feels different, if the connection feels different, don't dismiss it too quickly. Because sometimes the most important changes begin when the world is asleep. Sometimes the deepest realizations arrive in silence. And sometimes one sleepless night can reveal more than months of ordinary days ever could. Because while everyone else was sleeping, your soulmate was awakening to a truth they could no longer deny. And that truth will stay with them long after the night itself has been forgotten.